allow them to wear themselves out to the point where they no longer trust in themselves, where they realize, I can't go on, I can't do this. They'll beat their head against a rock of granite until finally they say, I give up. I'm helpless. This is a truth that someone must understand before they can be saved. I am helpless. I cannot. It's the difference between the tax collector and the Pharisee. The Pharisee could do it all. The tax collector could do nothing. Therefore, one walked away justified and the other condemned. Helpless. Martin Lloyd-Jones writes, without strength. What does this mean? It means total inability. It means that we were entirely devoid of any spiritual strength. Moral inability. Now again, oftentimes when you bring up the term moral inability, someone says, well, that can't be true. Well, why? Well, if man has no moral inability, then God can't judge him. I mean, you can't judge a blind man for not being able to find himself through, to pull himself through a maze or guide himself through a maze, because he's blind. It's not fair. So if man can't obey, then it's not fair for God to judge him when he doesn't obey. Yes, it is. And here's why. The moral inability, the reason why men cannot obey is because they will not obey. And they will not obey because they hate God. As I've said many, many times, it's like when Joseph's brothers, it is said about them that they could not speak a gentle or a kind word to him. They had tongues, they had minds, they knew the Hebrew speech. So why is it they could not speak a kind word to him? It says, because they hated him. It was their hatred that made them unable to speak a kind word to him, and therefore they are judged for their inability to speak a kind word. In the same way, men cannot obey God because they will not obey God, and they will not obey God because they hate him. And why do they hate him? Because he's good. You say, that's preposterous. No one would hate someone because they're good. Yes, someone will hate someone because they're good if the one hating is evil. It's like you've possibly heard maybe a bitter elderly woman saying, you know, I know she said that about me 25 years ago, but I just can't forgive her. Well, yes, you can forgive her. You won't, because of the animosity and hostility in your heart, and so you're judged. A political prisoner is in the cell, and all of a sudden the king against whom he has railed comes down, puts in the keys, throws open the cell door, and says, come out, you're free. All you have to do is bow to me. Now the man can go home. He can restore his family. He can begin to live again. Or he can stay in that prison until he dies. But because of the animosity in his heart, he says, I cannot bow my knee to you. Now, cannot is not really true unless he's got arthritic knees or something. The problem is not cannot. The problem is I will not. Now, Matthew Henry writes, we were without strength, in a sad condition, and which is worse, altogether unable to help ourselves out of that condition, lost in no visible way for our recovery, our condition deplorable, and in a manner desperate. People could do with a good dose of desperate. And how are people most put in a place of desperation? Through the truth. Through the truth. A man unaware that he is about to be run over by a charging rhino is fine. He's happy. His thoughts are collected. There's no problem in his life. He's walking through the plains of Africa. Maybe he's a bird watcher, and he's listening to music, and he's writing down the birds he's seeing in his little notebook, and he's totally happy because he's totally unaware of the truth. And then all of a sudden someone shouts, "There's a charging rhino coming right at you." In a moment's time, desperation is created. The truth. When men need to know the truth, that there's something charging at them more terrifying than a rhino. And it's not a something, it's a someone. It's God. Robert Haldane writes, "This introduces the proof of the love of God." I just told someone they're helpless. And by doing that, I introduced them to the love of God. That's why many of these preachers today who say they're not going to talk about sin, they can never talk about love. Never. They have no platform whatsoever to talk about the love of God to anyone. Because the love of God is most manifest in its nature of being unconditional. We're not surprised at love deserved, are we? I mean, if a supermodel married some movie star like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise or something, we wouldn't say she was merciful. She married me. It'd be a whole different story. You would say, "Behold, what manner of love is this? What mercy, what pity, what compassion. Is she blind?" In the same way, we can't introduce the love of God apart from speaking about the depravity of man. That's why, and it always happens, you can get a preacher stand up and preach in a church about the radical or total depravity of men. And some of the people in the church will be so mad they can't even walk out to the parking lot without falling down. And yet others are as happy and giddy as a 16-year-old schoolgirl on her first date. The difference between the lost and the saved. Those saved know something. That in the pitch blackness of my sin, Jesus Christ is that much more magnified. Robert Haldane again, "This introduces the proof of the love of God. Christ died for us while we were unable to obey Him and without ability to save ourselves." So we see it's not Christ coming to us, "Come along now, I'll help you. Walk this way. Take the first step and I'll take the next." No. He came to us while we were helpless. Now another term used here in verse 6 is ungodly. The word ungodly comes from a Greek word which denotes one who is impious or destitute of reverence toward God. Just defined our culture. And because our culture is so backward, we need to listen. Because our culture is so backward and our preaching so poor, that when a young man or young woman or anyone comes to know Christ, they begin a long, long journey back to piety. You listen to a lot of Christian music today, or the way worship goes on, or the way people speak about God, and you realize that even among the converted, They don't yet understand what piety is or reverence toward God. They can say things like, me and Jesus got our own thing going, or the man upstairs, or all sorts of things. One statement that's become popular and is so blasphemous I can hardly speak it in order to point it out that it's wicked, that Jesus is my homeboy. But at the same time, we must be very patient with the new believer. Why? There was a time, I suppose you could say, that when someone was saved, they were saved